The elevator doors sealed shut as the stranger collapsed. Elena began compressions, counting aloud through her fear. What no one realized, the man beneath her palms had built this hospital from nothing, and he'd never forget the quiet nurse who fought for him when his own heart failed. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The alarm had not yet sounded when Elena Mendoza opened her eyes in the darkness of her small apartment. But she already knew what had woken her, because she could hear her mother's voice drifting down the narrow hallway, calling out for a man who had been dead for 7 years. She pushed back the thin blanket and placed her feet on the cold floor, steadying herself for what the next few minutes would require, and then she moved quietly toward the sound, her heart heavy with a familiar ache that never seemed to lessen, no matter how many times she walked this path. Her mother, Rosalina, stood in the kitchen doorway, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes searching the shadows for someone who would never appear. Elena approached her slowly, gently, the way one might approach a frightened bird, and she took her mother's trembling hands in her own and began to hum the lullaby that Rosalina herself had sung decades ago when Elena was small and afraid of thunderstorms. The melody worked its ancient magic as it always did, and gradually the confusion in her mother's eyes softened into something like peace, and Elena guided her back to bed and administered the morning medication and sat beside her until her breathing grew deep and even. Only then did Elena allow herself to exhale, and she pressed her palm against her chest, where a tight knot of exhaustion and grief had taken permanent residence. She had 45 minutes before the first bus arrived at the corner, and she used them efficiently because efficiency was the architecture of her survival. She showered in water that never quite reached warm, dressed in scrubs that she had washed by hand the night before, and retrieved her coat from the hook beside the door. It was a gray wool coat that had once belonged to her father, and she wore it every day regardless of the season, because it still smelled faintly of him if she pressed her nose to the collar, but one of the buttons had fallen off months ago, and she kept meaning to fix it, and never did, because there was always something more urgent. Someone who needed her attention more than a coat needed a button. She locked the door behind her and walked to the bus stop in the pale gray light of a city that had not yet decided whether to wake, and she stood alone on the corner as the first buses rumbled past, carrying people to lives she could only imagine. When her bus finally arrived, she climbed aboard and took her usual seat near the back and watched the city scroll past the window, like a film she had seen too many times, and she thought about the day shift supervisor position that had been offered to her 3 weeks ago and how she had declined it without explanation. The truth was too complicated to speak aloud. The truth was that day shifts would mean leaving her mother alone for 8 hours or more, and professional caregivers cost more than the raise would cover, and so she had smiled and said she preferred the nights, and watched the flicker of confusion cross the manager's face before he moved on to someone else. She told herself it was fine. She told herself she liked the quiet of the night shift, the way the hospital felt almost sacred in those dark hours, the way she could give her patients the kind of attention that daylight and crowds made impossible. But sometimes on the bus she rehearsed conversations she would never have. Imagined herself speaking up in staff meetings, imagined herself being seen and heard and known, and then the bus would reach her stop, and she would step off and become invisible again. Which was safer, which was easier, which was the only way she knew how to be. Ashford Memorial Hospital rose against the morning sky like a great gray ship, its windows catching the first light of dawn, and Elena entered through the side door, as she always did, and made her way to the cardiac ward to clock in for the final 2 hours of her shift. The night had been uneventful, which was a blessing, and she used the remaining time to check on her patients one last time, to refill water pitchers and adjust pillows and offer whatever small comforts she could. Her colleague Brenda was already buzzing with gossip when Elena reached the nurse's station, her eyes bright with the pleasure of knowing something others did not. She leaned close and whispered that the owner was coming today. The actual owner, the man who had built this hospital from nothing 20 years ago and then vanished into the upper floors like a ghost. "They say he walks the halls in disguise," Brenda said, testing people, watching to see who deserves to stay and who deserves to go. Elena smiled politely and said nothing because she had heard this legend before and did not believe in ghosts or tests or billionaires who cared what happened on the 7th floor. She believed in the work, in the small, ordinary moments that no one noticed, but that meant everything to the person in the bed. She excused herself and went to room 712, where Mr. Huang was scheduled for surgery in 3 hours and had not slept all night because he was terrified he would not wake from the anesthesia. Elena sat beside him and held his hand and did not tell him that everything would be fine because she did not know if that was true. Instead, she asked him about his granddaughter, the one whose photograph he kept on the bedside table, and he talked for 20 minutes about her first piano recital and the way she had laughed when she made a mistake, and by the time Elena left, he was calm enough to close his eyes. In room 715, a young mother named Davy was crying because her newborn was in the NICU, and she felt like a failure for not being able to hold him, and Elena sat with her too and told her that love was not measured in hours held, but in hearts that refused to stop hoping. And Davy wept and thanked her, and Elena said there was nothing to thank her for. She was only doing what any person should do. By 7:45 her shift was officially over, but she stayed another 10 minutes to help an orderly transfer a patient, and then she gathered her things and headed for the service elevator at the end of the hall, because it was always empty and she could avoid the crowded main elevator where people made small talk and expected her to respond. The service elevator was her sanctuary. A small steel box where she could breathe for 30 seconds without anyone needing anything from her, and she pressed the button and waited and thought about what she would make her mother for breakfast when she got home. The doors opened and she stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. And just before the doors closed, a man slipped through the gap, tall and gray-haired, wearing a plain coat that looked expensive despite its simplicity. He nodded at her and she nodded back, and then the doors sealed shut and the elevator began its descent. She noticed that he looked tired, pale, that there were shadows beneath his eyes and a tightness around his mouth. But she did not speak because she never spoke first, and he did not seem like a man who wanted conversation. They passed the 6th floor, and then the elevator shuddered and stopped, and the lights flickered, and Elena's heart began to pound because she hated enclosed spaces, hated the feeling of walls pressing in, hated the way her breath grew shallow and her hands grew cold. She gripped the railing and told herself it would start again in a moment. These things always resolved themselves. But then she heard a sound beside her and turned to see the man clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. And before she could speak, he collapsed to the floor. For one terrible second, Elena froze, her mind blank with panic. And then her training took over, and she dropped to her knees beside him and pressed her fingers to his neck and felt nothing, no pulse, no sign of life, and she knew that if she did not act immediately, he would die in this steel box between the 5th and 6th floors. She positioned her hands on his chest and began compressions, counting aloud because the sound of her own voice steadied her, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And she pressed down hard and fast the way she had been taught, the way she had practiced on mannequins 100 times, but never on a real person whose life depended on the strength of her arms and the rhythm of her counting. Her shoulders burned and her wrists ached and sweat dripped down her temples. But she did not stop. She refused to stop. She would not let this stranger die alone in an elevator when she had the power to save him. She counted and pressed and counted and pressed, and the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and she began to fear that it was not enough, that she was not enough. And then suddenly he gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, and his eyes flew open and met hers, and she saw terror and confusion, and something that looked almost like wonder. He tried to speak, and she told him not to, told him to stay still, told him help was coming, but he shook his head and whispered 3 words that she would never forget. Do not stop talking. So she talked, because it was the only thing he asked, and she could not deny a dying man his one request. She talked about the weather, about how the rain had finally stopped after 3 days, and her mother's roses would be grateful. She talked about the tomato plants on their tiny balcony, how they never grew taller than 6 inches. But her mother refused to give up on them. She talked about nothing and everything, her voice trembling but constant. A thread of sound connecting him to the world of the living. And she kept her hand on his chest so he could feel that he was not alone. And then the elevator shuddered again and began to move. And the doors opened onto the lobby, and the world rushed in. Nurses and security guards swarmed around them, shouting orders and pushing equipment, and Elena scrambled backward to give them space, her legs shaking so badly she could hardly stand. A man in a tailored suit pushed through the crowd, his face pale with shock, and he stopped short when he saw the gray-haired man on the floor. "That is Mr. Ashford," he said, his voice breaking. "That is the founder." Elena stared at him, uncomprehending, and then she looked back at the man she had just saved, the man whose heart she had restarted with her own 2 hands, and she realized that she had never seen him before, because she worked the night shift and read no newspapers and paid no attention to the portraits in the lobby. She had saved the life of the man who built this hospital, and she had not even known his name. The medical team lifted him onto a stretcher and rushed him toward the ICU, and Elena stood alone in the emptying lobby, her hands still trembling, her scrubs damp with sweat, and no one looked at her, no one asked if she was all right. No one seemed to remember that she had been there at all. She walked to the locker room in a daze and changed out of her scrubs and retrieved her father's coat and clocked out 7 minutes late, and the woman at the desk did not ask why. She rode the bus home with her forehead pressed against the window, replaying the moment over and over. The weight of his chest beneath her palms, the sound of his gasp, the look in his eyes when he asked her not to stop talking. She did not know that at that very moment, in the ICU on the 9th floor, Daniel Ashford was fighting off sedation long enough to ask a single question. He gripped the nurse's wrist and demanded to know the name of the woman in the elevator, the one with the dark hair and the quiet voice, the one who had talked to him about tomatoes, while his heart remembered how to beat. The nurse did not know her name, but she promised to find out, and Daniel closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, holding on to the sound of that voice like a lifeline, like a prayer, like the first true thing he had heard in 20 years. Elena did not sleep that night or the night after, and when she closed her eyes, she saw only the elevator doors sealing shut, and the stranger collapsing, and her own hands pressing against his chest in a rhythm that had become the drumbeat of her waking hours. She replayed the moment obsessively, dissecting every second, wondering if she had done enough, if she had done it correctly, if there was something she should have noticed sooner that might have prevented his collapse entirely. She had not known his name when she knelt beside him on that cold steel floor, had not known that his face appeared on plaques throughout the hospital and in photographs she had walked past 1,000 times without seeing. Daniel Ashford, the founder, the man who had built Ashford Memorial from nothing, who had poured his fortune into its walls and his grief into its mission, who had not been seen on the lower floors in years because he existed in a realm so far above hers that they might as well have inhabited different planets, and yet for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. According to the maintenance log that recorded the elevator's malfunction, they had shared the same small steel box, and she had held his life in her hands and talked to him about tomatoes. The absurdity of it made her want to laugh and weep simultaneously, and she did neither, because her mother was calling from the bedroom, and there was medication to administer, and tea to prepare, and a life to maintain regardless of what had happened between the 5th and 6th floors. But on the second day something shifted, something Elena had not expected and did not know how to receive. Her mother woke lucid, truly lucid, her eyes clear and present in a way they had not been for months. She remembered Elena's name without prompting, remembered what day it was, remembered that Elena worked at the hospital and had come home looking shaken the morning before. She asked what had happened, and Elena told her, haltingly, minimizing her own role because she did not know how to claim credit for anything, and her mother listened with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that Elena had made with extra honey the way she liked it. When Elena finished speaking, her mother was quiet for a long moment, and then she reached across the small kitchen table and took Elena's hand in hers, her grip surprisingly strong, and she said that she was proud of her. She said that Elena had always been the kind of person who showed up when others looked away, who stayed when others left, who gave without counting the cost. And she said that even if the world never saw her, even if she spent her whole life in the margins where no one thought to look, she should know that her mother saw her and had always seen her, and would carry the sight of her like a lantern until her last breath. Elena held herself together until her mother released her hand and turned to look out the window at the pale winter light. And then she rose and walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink and wept, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, convulsive way of someone who has carried a weight alone for so long that even a single word of recognition is enough to crack the walls she has built around her heart. She wept for her mother and for herself, and for all the years of invisible labor that no one would ever know about, and then she dried her eyes and washed the teacups and prepared for another night shift as though nothing had changed. Because that was what she knew how to do. That was the only way she knew how to survive. 3 days after the elevator incident, Elena arrived at the hospital for her shift and found a message waiting for her at the nurse's station, a small folded paper with her name written in precise handwriting she did not recognize. She was to report to the administrative floor immediately. The 12th floor. She had never been to the 12th floor, had never had reason to go there, had assumed it was a place reserved for people whose names appeared on letterheads and whose signatures determined fates. Her first thought was that she had done something wrong. Her second thought was that she was going to be fired. She rode the elevator with her heart pounding against her ribs, watching the numbers climb. And when the doors opened, she stepped into a world she did not recognize. The floors were marble, the walls were lined with artwork that looked like it belonged in museums, and the silence was so complete that she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. A man appeared before her, tall and thin and immaculately dressed, and he introduced himself as Mr. Colton, the senior administrator, and he looked at her the way one might look at a stain on an otherwise pristine carpet. He informed her that Mr. Ashford wished to thank her personally for her actions in the elevator, and that she should follow him to the private recovery suite where Mr. Ashford was completing his recuperation. Elena wanted to say that thanks were not necessary, that she had only done what anyone would do, that she would prefer to return to the 7th floor where she understood the rules and knew her place. But Mr. Colton was already walking, and she had no choice but to follow. The private recovery suite was not like any hospital room Elena had ever seen. It looked more like a luxury hotel, with floor-to-ceiling windows and fresh flowers on every surface, and a silence so profound it felt almost sacred. And there, in a chair by the window, sat Daniel Ashford, pale and thin but alert. His gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floor. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, perching on the edge of a chair that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, and she folded her hands in her lap to stop them from trembling and waited for him to speak. He thanked her. The words were simple, unadorned, and he delivered them without flourish or ceremony. He said that she had saved his life and that he did not take such things lightly. Elena stammered a response, something about training and instinct and being in the right place at the right time, and he watched her with those gray eyes that seemed to see everything she was trying to hide. He asked how long she had worked at the hospital. 7 years, she said. He asked if she enjoyed it. She said yes, and it was not a lie. Not exactly, but it was not the whole truth either. He asked why she worked the night shift, and she hesitated because the real answer was too complicated and too personal and none of his business, and she said simply that she preferred it, that she liked the quiet. He nodded as though he understood, and perhaps he did, and then he asked the question that would echo in her mind for weeks afterward. He asked what she had said to him in the elevator. She blinked, confused. She barely remembered. She had been so focused on the compressions, on the counting, on keeping him alive, that the words had simply spilled out without thought or intention. Something about the weather, she said. Something about her mother's garden. Tomatoes that never grew taller than 6 inches. Roses that bloomed despite the shade. She felt foolish, saying it aloud, felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but Daniel Ashford did not laugh. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice when he spoke was quieter than before, rougher, as though the words cost him something to say. He told her that in 20 years of building this hospital, of hiring the finest specialists and installing the most advanced equipment and creating protocols designed to save lives with maximum efficiency, he had never once considered what it might mean to talk to a dying man about gardens. He told her that she had talked to him like he was a person, not a patient, not a problem to solve, not a liability or a statistic or a name on a chart. A person. And he had not been talked to like a person in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like. Elena did not know what to say. She sat in that beautiful room with its flowers and its silence, and she looked at this man who owned everything around her, and she saw something in his eyes that she recognized, something that looked almost like loneliness. And she did not understand how a man who had so much could carry that particular weight. She thanked him for his kind words and rose to leave because she did not know what else to do. And as she walked toward the door, he said her name, Elena. She turned. He told her that he would not forget what she had done. She nodded and left, and rode the elevator back down to the 7th floor, where the lights were fluorescent and the floors were linoleum. And no one looked at her the way Daniel Ashford had looked at her, like she had given him something priceless, when all she had given him was words about tomatoes and roses and rain. In the weeks that followed, Daniel Ashford returned to work, but something had changed in him. Something that the people around him noticed without understanding. He had always been a distant figure, a name on documents and a face in portraits. A man who occupied the upper floors and rarely descended to the realm where the actual work of healing took place. But now he walked the halls. He visited the wards. He stood in doorways and watched and listened and said nothing. And the staff whispered among themselves about what it meant, whether he was planning layoffs or reorganization or some other upheaval that would disrupt their carefully ordered lives. They did not know that he was watching one person, and that person was Elena Mendoza. He watched her without her knowledge, not intrusively, not possessively, but with a curiosity that bordered on reverence. He saw her buy coffee for a janitor named Marco, who worked the night shift and never complained, even though his knees ached and his wife was sick, and no one ever asked how he was doing. He saw her sit with a dying patient named Arthur, who had no family, no friends, no one to hold his hand as he slipped away. And she held it anyway. She stayed with him until the end. She made sure that the last thing he felt in this world was the warmth of human touch. He saw her give her lunch to a young resident named Priya, who had been on call for 30 hours and forgotten to eat, and when Priya tried to thank her, Elena just smiled and said she was not hungry anyway, which was a lie, which was obviously a lie, but she told it with such grace that it became a gift. Daniel had spent 20 years building this hospital. He had hired the best surgeons, installed the finest equipment, created systems designed to maximize outcomes and minimize errors, and turn the chaos of human suffering into something manageable and measurable. And he had succeeded. Ashford Memorial was ranked among the top hospitals in the region. Its mortality rates were below the national average. Its patient satisfaction scores were acceptable. Its financial performance was strong. By every metric that mattered to the world, he had built something remarkable. But watching Elena move through the halls, invisible and unsung, performing small acts of kindness that would never appear on any report or earn any recognition, he began to wonder if he had missed something essential. He began to wonder if the metrics that mattered to the world were not the metrics that mattered to the people in the beds. He began to wonder what a hospital was actually for, and whether the one he had built was fulfilling that purpose, or merely pretending to. He thought about Maria, his wife, who had died in an elevator 23 years ago because no one knew CPR and the paramedics arrived too late. He had built this hospital in her memory, had poured his grief into its foundations and his love into its walls, and he had believed that if he made it excellent enough, efficient enough, successful enough, it would mean something. It would justify the loss. It would transform his pain into purpose. But excellence was not the same as compassion. Efficiency was not the same as humanity. Success was not the same as meaning. And a hospital could save a life without ever once treating the person inside it as a person. Elena did not know any of this. She did not know that Daniel Ashford watched her from doorways and wondered how she had learned to be the way she was. She did not know that he had requested her personnel file and read it 3 times, looking for some explanation for her kindness, some training program or mentorship or formative experience that had shaped her into the person who talked to dying men about gardens. He found nothing. Her file was unremarkable. Good evaluations, no complaints, no commendations, no evidence that anyone had ever noticed her at all. She was invisible, just as she had always been, just as she had perhaps chosen to be. But Daniel saw her now. And once he saw her, he could not look away, because she was the answer to a question he had been asking for 20 years without knowing how to phrase it. She was what he had been trying to build all along. She was what he had been missing. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by a folded note this time, but by the head of human resources herself. A woman named Patricia Vance, whom Elena had never spoken to and had only seen from a distance at mandatory staff meetings. She appeared at the nurse's station just as Elena was finishing her shift, her smile professional and her eyes unreadable. And she asked if Elena might have a moment to speak privately about an opportunity. Elena's stomach dropped because in her experience opportunities were just problems wearing better clothes, but she followed Patricia to an office on the 10th floor that smelled of new carpet and fresh coffee and contained furniture that looked like it had never been sat upon. Patricia gestured for her to sit and then opened a folder and began to speak about a newly created position called Patient Experience Coordinator, a role that would involve working directly with patients and families to ensure their emotional and practical needs were met throughout their hospital stay. The position came with a significant raise: a private office, regular hours, weekends off, and the chance to shape the program from the ground up. It was, Patricia said with that professional smile, an extraordinary opportunity for someone with Elena's particular gifts. Elena sat very still and felt the walls of the office pressing in around her and tried to understand what was happening. She had never been offered anything like this. She had never been noticed enough to be offered anything at all. And now here was this woman with her folder and her smile telling her that someone had seen her, someone had recognized what she did, and they wanted to give her more. She should have been elated. She should have accepted on the spot. Instead, she felt a cold dread spreading through her chest because she already knew, before she even did the math, that she could not say yes. The position was a day shift role. 8 in the morning to 5 in the evening, Monday through Friday, the hours when her mother needed her most, the hours when Rosalina was most likely to wander or fall, or forget to eat or leave the stove on, or open the door to strangers. Elena had looked into professional caregivers before, had called agencies and compared rates, and done the calculations late at night when she should have been sleeping. And every time the numbers came out the same. A qualified caregiver for 8 hours a day would cost more than the raise would cover. She would actually lose money by taking the promotion. She would gain a title and an office and regular hours, and she would lose the ability to keep her mother safe. She asked Patricia if she could have some time to think about it. Patricia's smile flickered just for a moment. And then she said, "Of course. Take a few days. But don't take too long because opportunities like this don't come around often." Elena thanked her and left, and rode the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the gray morning air and stood on the sidewalk and felt something inside her crack. Not break, not yet, but crack, a fissure running through the architecture of her acceptance. She wanted this. She wanted it so badly she could taste it. This chance to do work that mattered in a way that was visible. This chance to be seen and valued and recognized. And she could not have it. She could not reach for it without letting go of her mother, and she would never let go of her mother, and so she would stay where she was, invisible and unsung. And she would tell herself it was fine. It was what she preferred. It was the only way. She returned to Human Resources 2 days later and declined the position. She did not explain why. She smiled and thanked Patricia for the consideration, and said it simply was not the right fit for her at this time, and Patricia looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt, and said she understood. And Elena walked out, knowing that she had just closed a door that would never open again. The whispers started almost immediately. Elena did not know how the news spread, whether Patricia had mentioned it to someone or whether the hospital grapevine had simply done what it always did. But within days everyone seemed to know that Elena Mendoza had been offered a promotion and turned it down. That quiet, invisible Elena had somehow caught the attention of administration and then refused their gift, like she thought she was too good for it. Brenda was the first to change, her gossipy warmth curdling into something sharp and watchful, her eyes following Elena with a suspicion that bordered on hostility. She stopped including Elena in conversations at the nurses' station. She forgot to pass along messages. She scheduled herself for breaks at times when Elena would be left alone to cover the entire ward. Other colleagues followed her lead, because Brenda had been there for 15 years and knew how to shape the social landscape without ever saying anything that could be reported. Elena found herself excluded from birthday celebrations and shift swaps and the small daily kindnesses that made the work bearable. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had never been part of those things anyway, and so she could not miss what she had never had. But it did matter. It mattered more than she wanted to admit, and she felt the isolation settling over her like a second skin, familiar and suffocating. Then the complaint was filed. Elena learned about it from Patricia Vance, who called her back to that same office with the new carpet and the untouched furniture, and informed her that a formal concern had been raised about her conduct with a patient's family. Apparently she had overstepped her bounds, had given medical advice she was not qualified to give, had made promises the hospital could not keep. Elena listened in disbelief because she knew exactly which interaction they were referring to, a conversation she had had with the daughter of a dying man in room 722 who had asked her whether her father was in pain. And Elena had said that the care team was doing everything possible to keep him comfortable, which was true, which was not advice, which was the most basic human response to a grieving daughter's desperate question. But someone had reported it as a protocol violation, had twisted her words into something they were not, and now there was a formal complaint in her file that would follow her for years. She did not defend herself. She did not know how. She had spent her whole life assuming that if something went wrong, it must be her fault, that she must have done something to deserve whatever punishment came, and so she simply nodded and thanked Patricia for informing her, and walked out with the complaint lodged in her record like a splinter she could not reach. That night she went to the hospital chapel. She did not go there often, was not sure she believed in the kind of God who listened to prayers in small, quiet rooms, but she needed somewhere to sit where no one would look at her or need anything from her, and the chapel was always empty at this hour. She settled into a pew near the back and closed her eyes and let the silence wash over her, and tried to remember why she had become a nurse in the first place, whether it had ever meant anything, or whether she had simply drifted into it because it was expected, because it was available, because she had never believed she deserved to want anything more. She did not hear the door open. She did not know anyone else was there until a voice spoke from the darkness, quiet and rough and familiar, and she opened her eyes to see Daniel Ashford standing in the aisle, looking at her with an expression she could not read. He asked if he was interrupting. She said no. He sat down in the pew across from hers, not too close, not presumptuous, just present, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he asked why she had turned down the promotion. Elena stiffened. She had not expected the question, had not known he even knew about the offer, and she felt exposed in a way that made her want to flee. She said it was not the right fit. He said that was not an answer. She said it was the only answer she had. He was quiet again, and she could feel him watching her. Not demanding, not pressing, just waiting with a patience that unnerved her because she was not used to being waited for. And then, without understanding why, she told him the truth. She told him about her mother. She told him about the dementia that had started 3 years ago and progressed faster than anyone expected. stealing memories and words and recognition in waves that came without warning and receded without pattern. She told him about the cost of care, the impossible mathematics of need and income, the way she had structured her entire life around the hours when her mother was most vulnerable. She told him about the guilt, the constant grinding guilt of wanting more than she had, of resenting the very person she loved most in the world, of feeling like a failure for not being able to hold it all together when holding it all together was the only thing she knew how to do. She told him about the promotion and the raise that would not cover the caregiver and the door she had closed because she had no other choice. And by the time she finished, she was not crying. She was too tired to cry, but her voice was raw and her hands were trembling, and she had never said any of this to anyone, had never let anyone see the weight she carried. And she did not know why she was letting him see it now. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, and she thought perhaps she had made a mistake. Perhaps she had revealed too much, and he would look at her differently now, with pity or discomfort, or the particular distaste that people reserved for those who could not manage their own lives. But when he spoke, his voice was not pitying. It was heavy with something that sounded almost like recognition. He told her about Maria. He told her about his wife of 12 years who had been the kindest person he had ever known, who had volunteered at shelters and visited nursing homes and never once walked past a person in need without stopping to help. He told her about the day Maria collapsed in an elevator in a building downtown, cardiac arrest, sudden and total, and no one in that elevator knew CPR, and by the time the paramedics arrived, she was gone. He told her about the months after, the grief that hollowed him out and left nothing but the shell of a man who had once known how to love. And he told her about the decision he had made in that emptiness, the vow he had taken to build a hospital where no one would ever die the way Maria had died, where there would always be someone who knew what to do, where technology and training and protocol would ensure that every life could be saved if saving was possible. He had poured everything into Ashford Memorial. His money, his time, his energy, his grief. He had hired the best doctors and installed the finest equipment and created systems designed to maximize outcomes and minimize errors. He had built something remarkable, something that had saved thousands of lives, and he had believed it was enough. But somewhere along the way he had forgotten why he started. He had focused on expansion and reputation and rankings, on metrics that looked good in reports and impressed boards of directors, and he had forgotten that a hospital was not a machine for processing patients, but a place where human beings came in their most vulnerable moments and needed to be seen and held and cared for. He had forgotten the humanity. He had forgotten Maria. Elena listened to him the way he had listened to her, without interrupting, without judging, and when he finished, she said something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said that he had not forgotten. She said that no one could carry that weight alone, not the grief, and not the mission, and not the impossible task of trying to save everyone when saving everyone was not possible. She said that forgetting was not a moral failure but a survival mechanism, a way of setting down a burden that had grown too heavy to bear, and that remembering was not about guilt but about choosing to pick it up again. She said that he had built something extraordinary, even if he had lost sight of why, and that the why was still there, waiting for him to return to it, waiting for him to see it. Daniel looked at her in the dim light of the chapel, this quiet woman who worked the night shift and turned down promotions and talked to dying men about gardens. And he saw her fully for the first time, not as a symbol, not as an answer to his questions, not as proof that kindness still existed, but as a person carrying her own unbearable weight with a grace that broke his heart, a person who deserved to be seen the way she saw others. He did not know what to say, so he said nothing, and they sat together in the silence of the chapel as the night deepened around them, two people who had found each other in the margins and recognized something familiar in each other's eyes. 1 week later, Elena was summoned to Mr. Colton's office. She knew before she arrived that something was wrong because Colton had never requested to see her before, and his secretary's voice on the phone had been clipped and formal in a way that suggested bad news. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and watched his face and saw no warmth there, no sympathy, only the cold satisfaction of a man who had found a problem and intended to solve it. He informed her that a formal investigation had been opened into her conduct during the elevator incident. According to the complaint, she had performed medical interventions beyond her scope of practice, had acted without authorization, had endangered the patient through reckless and unqualified action. The accusation was absurd. She had performed CPR, the most basic life-saving intervention, something she was trained and certified to do, something any person on the street could do and would be praised for doing. But Colton did not care about facts. Colton cared about order and hierarchy and the proper functioning of systems. And Elena had disrupted his systems by being noticed, by being summoned to the 12th floor, by catching the attention of the man whose name was on the building. She was a loose thread, and he intended to pull her until she unraveled. She was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. She would retain her pay during the suspension, he said, as though this were a kindness. But she would not be permitted to enter the hospital or contact patients or speak to colleagues about the case. She would go home and wait and hope that the investigation found in her favor. Though his tone made clear he did not expect it to. Elena sat in that chair and felt the ground dissolving beneath her. She could not afford to lose this job. She could not afford the gap in income, the loss of insurance, the catastrophic unraveling that would follow if she could not work. Her mother depended on her. Everything depended on her. And this man, with his cold eyes and his satisfied smile, was taking it all away because she had saved a life in an elevator, and someone had decided that this made her dangerous. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She did not have the words, or the energy, or the belief that words would make any difference. She simply nodded and rose and walked out of his office and through the halls of the hospital that had been her home for 7 years, and she felt the eyes on her as she passed, the whispers, the judgment, and she kept her head down and her face still, and she did not let them see her break. She took the bus home and sat beside her mother, who did not recognize her that day, and held her hand anyway, and stared out the window at the city that did not see her, and wondered how much longer she could keep going, how much more weight she could carry before her legs gave out. And she collapsed the way Daniel had collapsed in the elevator. Except there would be no one there to save her, no one to press their hands against her chest and count and refuse to stop, no one to talk to her about gardens and roses and rain until her heart remembered how to beat. The first week of suspension, Elena told herself it would be fine. She told herself the investigation would clear her name because she had done nothing wrong, because the footage would show what actually happened, because truth still meant something even in a world that seemed determined to punish her for existing. She applied for jobs at other hospitals, filling out applications late at night after her mother fell asleep, listing her qualifications and experience, and hoping that the suspension would not follow her, that she could start fresh somewhere else and rebuild the careful architecture of survival she had spent 7 years constructing. But the suspension did follow her. She did not know how, whether Colton had made calls, or whether the medical community was simply small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but the responses to her applications were polite and swift and final. "We regret to inform you, we have decided to pursue other candidates. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." Each rejection landed like a stone in her chest, and by the end of the second week, she had stopped applying because hope was a resource she could no longer afford to waste. The money ran out faster than she expected. She had never had savings, had never earned enough to set anything aside, and within 3 weeks she was choosing between her mother's medications and the electric bill, between food and the bus fare she would need if she ever worked again. She chose the medications. She always chose the medications. She ate rice and beans and told herself it was enough, and she watched her mother's face for signs of decline and prayed that the pills were working even as she felt her own body growing weaker from the inside out. Then her mother fell. It happened on a Thursday morning while Elena was in the bathroom, just 30 seconds out of sight, and she heard the sound and came running and found Rosalina on the kitchen floor, her arm bent at an angle that made Elena's stomach lurch, her eyes open but unfocused, her mouth forming words that were not words. Elena called for an ambulance and rode with her mother to the emergency room of a hospital across town. Not Ashford Memorial, because she could not bear to go there, could not bear to see the faces of the people who had watched her leave in disgrace. She sat in the waiting room for 6 hours while her mother was examined and x-rayed and admitted for observation, and she held Rosalina's hand when they finally let her into the room and looked at her mother's face, so pale against the white pillow, so fragile, so far away. The doctors said it was a fractured wrist and a mild concussion, that she would recover, that she was lucky it was not worse. But Elena knew it could have been worse and would be worse if she could not find a way to care for her mother properly, if she could not find work and income and stability, if she could not stop the slow unraveling that had begun the moment the elevator doors opened and everyone saw Daniel Ashford on the floor and no one saw her. She sat beside her mother's bed through the night, listening to the beeping of machines and the distant voices of nurses in the hallway, and she felt the walls closing in around her, felt the weight of everything she carried pressing down until she could barely breathe. Her mother's eyes were closed. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She looked so small in that bed, so diminished, and Elena remembered when she had been the child and her mother had been the strong one, the one who knew how to fix everything, the one who made the world feel safe. She leaned close and took her mother's hand and whispered the words she had never said aloud to anyone. "I do not know how to keep going. I do not know how to carry this anymore. I am so tired, Mama. I am so tired and I do not know what to do." Her mother did not respond. Her mother could not hear her. And Elena sat in that room with the beeping machines and the fluorescent lights, and she felt something inside her finally break. Not crack, not fracture, but break, and she did not know if she would ever be able to put it back together. Across the city, in the boardroom on the 14th floor of Ashford Memorial Hospital, Daniel Ashford sat at the head of a long polished table and looked at the faces of the men and women who ran his hospital and felt a fury building in his chest that he had not felt in 20 years. He had learned of Elena's suspension 3 days earlier, had demanded to see the complaint and the evidence and the justification for removing a nurse who had saved his life, and what he had found was a fabrication so transparent, so malicious, so utterly without merit that he could barely contain his rage. The complaint alleged that Elena had performed medical interventions beyond her scope of practice. The complaint alleged that she had endangered the patient through reckless action. The complaint was signed by Brenda Holloway, a nurse on the cardiac ward who had worked with Elena for years and who had, according to the interviews Daniel had quietly conducted, grown jealous of the attention Elena had received after the elevator incident. The complaint had been encouraged and facilitated by Mr. Colton, who sat at the far end of the table now with his hands folded and his face composed, as though he had done nothing wrong, as though he had simply followed protocol, as though protocol were a god that must be served regardless of the human cost. Daniel had reviewed the security footage from the elevator. He had watched Elena drop to her knees beside him, had watched her check his pulse and begin compressions, had watched her count aloud and refuse to stop, even as her arms trembled and her face contorted with effort. He had watched her save his life with textbook precision, with flawless technique, with a calm determination that most trained professionals could not match. There was no protocol violation. There was no reckless action. There was only a woman doing exactly what she had been trained to do, what any decent person would do, what he himself had built this hospital to ensure would always be done. And for this she had been suspended and humiliated and driven from the only job she had, the only income that stood between her mother and catastrophe. Daniel looked at Colton and felt the fury settle into something colder and more precise. He asked the board a question. He asked them what this hospital was for. The room was silent. No one answered because no one knew what he wanted them to say, and perhaps no one had thought about the question in years. Perhaps they had all forgotten that there was supposed to be an answer beyond profit margins and patient volumes and rankings in magazines. Daniel told them about Maria. He told them about his wife who had died in an elevator 23 years ago because no one knew how to help her, because the people around her were bystanders instead of responders, because the systems that should have saved her did not exist. He told them that he had built Ashford Memorial to ensure that no one would ever die the way Maria had died, that there would always be someone who knew what to do, that every person who walked through these doors would be seen and cared for and given the chance to survive. He told them that Elena Mendoza had done exactly that. She had seen him, she had cared for him, she had given him the chance to survive. And for this, he asked them what that said about what they had become. He asked them what Maria would think if she could see them now. He asked them if they were proud. The room remained silent. Colton shifted in his seat, his composure beginning to crack, and Daniel turned to him and spoke in a voice that was quiet and level and devastating. He said that Colton was terminated, effective immediately. He said that the complaint against Elena was dismissed and expunged from her record. He said that Elena was reinstated with full back pay and an apology from the hospital administration. And then he announced something else, something he had been thinking about since that night in the chapel, when Elena had told him about her mother, and he had seen the weight she carried and understood that she was not alone, that there were countless others like her, people who worked in this hospital and cared for patients while their own families suffered because they could not afford the help they needed. He announced the creation of the Maria Ashford Fund, a new initiative to provide caregiver support for hospital employees with ailing family members. The fund would cover the cost of professional caregivers, medical equipment, respite services, anything that would allow employees to do their jobs without sacrificing the people they loved. Elena Mendoza would be the first recipient. He looked around the table at the faces of his board members, and he saw shock and discomfort and something that might have been shame. And he did not care. He had spent 20 years building systems and protocols and hierarchies, and he had forgotten that systems were only as good as the people who ran them, that protocols meant nothing if they were used as weapons, that hierarchies existed to serve the mission, not to protect the powerful from accountability. He had forgotten why he started. Elena had reminded him, and now he would rebuild this hospital the way it should have been built from the beginning, with humanity at its center, with kindness as its measure, with Maria's memory honored not in plaques and portraits, but in the way every person who walked through these doors was treated. 1 week later, Elena returned to Ashford Memorial. She had received the call from Patricia Vance 3 days earlier, had listened in disbelief as Patricia explained that the investigation had been concluded and all charges had been dropped, and she was welcome to return to work at her earliest convenience with full back pay and the sincere apologies of the hospital administration. She had not known what to say. She had not known how to process the reversal, the whiplash from despair to reprieve, and she had simply thanked Patricia and hung up and sat in her apartment, staring at the wall while her mother slept in the next room. She learned about the Maria Ashford Fund from a letter that arrived the following day, a formal notification that she had been selected as the first recipient and that a caregiver would be provided for her mother, beginning immediately at no cost to her. She read the letter 3 times, and then she set it down and wept. Not the quiet, restrained weeping she had permitted herself before, but deep, shuddering sobs that came from somewhere far inside her, from the place where she had stored all the grief and fear and exhaustion she had not allowed herself to feel. She wept for her mother and for herself and for the years of invisible struggle that someone had finally seen. She wept because she had been saved, and she had not expected to be saved, and she did not know how to hold the gift of it. When she walked into the hospital on her first day back, she felt different in a way she could not quite name. The halls were the same, the faces were the same, but something had shifted inside her. Some wall had come down or some door had opened, and she moved through the space differently than she had before. Colleagues who had ignored her now greeted her, some with genuine warmth and some with the awkward deference of people who knew they had behaved badly and did not know how to make it right. Brenda was not there. Brenda had been transferred to another floor at her own request, unable to face Elena after what she had done. Elena did not hate her. She understood jealousy and fear and the way people lashed out when they felt threatened. But more than the way others treated her, what had changed was the way Elena treated herself. She spoke up. She greeted people first. She held space in conversations instead of shrinking into the margins. She had spent her whole life believing that invisibility was safety, that if she made herself small enough, no one could hurt her. But she had been hurt anyway, had been hurt precisely because she was invisible, because no one saw her clearly enough to defend her. She would not be invisible anymore. She would not apologize for existing. She would take up space in the world because she had earned that space, because her kindness mattered even if it was not measured or marketed, because she deserved to be seen. She was assigned to the new patient advocacy team, a position that reported to Daniel's office and involved working with patients and families to ensure their needs were met throughout their hospital stay. It was the job she had been offered before and could not accept. But now she could accept it because her mother was cared for, because the fund had given her the freedom to reach for what she wanted, because someone had seen the weight she carried and helped her set it down. On her first day in the new role, she wore a coat that had arrived at her apartment in a simple box with no card. It was gray wool, beautifully made, with buttons that were secure and a collar that smelled of nothing but newness and possibility. She did not need to ask who had sent it. She knew. 6 months later, Elena stood in the rooftop garden of Ashford Memorial Hospital and looked out at the city spread below her, the buildings and streets and countless lives unfolding in patterns she would never see, but that mattered nonetheless. The garden had been completed in the spring, a gift from Daniel to the hospital and to the memory of his wife, and it was named the Maria Ashford Healing Garden. It was filled with flowers and benches and winding paths, and it was open to patients and families and staff who needed a place to breathe and remember that the world contained beauty even in the midst of suffering. Elena came here often, usually in the evening after her shift, and she sat on a bench near the roses and thought about everything that had brought her to this place. Her mother was stable now, cared for during the day by a woman named Grace who had become like family. And Elena visited her every evening and found her more often lucid than not, more often present than lost. The doctors said it was not a cure, that the disease would continue its slow progression. But for now there was peace, there was time, there was the grace of moments that Elena had thought she would never have. Daniel appeared beside her as he often did in the evenings, and they walked together through the garden without speaking because they had learned that silence between them was not empty, but full, a shared space where words were not always necessary. He told her that he was reconciling with his son. He told her that James had called him for the first time in 3 years, and they had talked for 2 hours, and it had been awkward and painful, and the most important conversation of his life. He told her that Elena had reminded him that presence mattered more than legacy, that showing up for the people you loved was more important than building monuments to your grief. He told her he was trying to be present now. He was trying to show up. Elena smiled and said she was glad. They walked a little further and stopped at a bench overlooking the city. And Elena sat down and looked at the lights beginning to flicker on in the buildings below. Daniel asked her what she was thinking. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she used to think kindness was something you gave away. She used to think it was a one-way transaction, something that left you and went to someone else and was gone. But now she thought it was something that came back. Not always from where you expected, not always in the form you expected, but it came back. It found its way home. Daniel smiled, and the smile reached his eyes in a way that it rarely had before. And he sat beside her on the bench, and they looked out at the city together as the last light faded from the sky. Behind them, the hospital glowed with warmth and purpose. Its windows lit against the darkness, its halls filled with people who were trying to heal and people who were trying to help them, and the infinite small moments of kindness that no one would ever count, but that mattered more than anything that could be measured. And above it all the garden bloomed. The roses and the lavender and the tomato plants that Elena had insisted on adding, because they reminded her of her mother, and the evening air was soft and carried the scent of growing things and the sound of the city settling into night. 2 people sat on a bench in that garden, 2 people who had saved each other without ever meaning to, who had found each other in the margins and recognized something familiar in each other's eyes. They did not know what the future held, They did not need to know. They only knew that they were here, now, together, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.